uh, one ethnic group 150 years ago, but as a result of Dutch and Belgian colonialism um, and the choices made by imperial masters, small differences um, in vocation, etc., created and became essentialized um, ethnic differences. Um, Now, what's interesting is that traditionally, right, in most of the world, people have identified not with ethnicity, but with either smaller, more micro, or more macro identities, such as the tribe and clan, right? I mean, prior to the mass movement of people, prior to print technologies, prior to the mass distribution of reading material, in particular vernaculars, uh, most people really, didn't know more individuals than their tribe or clan, and so that was their sort of most important form of identity. Religion, of course, which is more macro, was also an important identity historically. Vocation, as I mentioned earlier, the Rwandans, they often individuals often identified with their vocation, but slowly and surely, as a result of as a result of modernization, as a result also of imperialism, people began to think of themselves as ethnic group. Okay, and this, in fact, aided the imperialists in their divide and conquer strategies, as it did in Rwanda. Um, okay, and so this also created sort of the idea of national identity and nationalism, which is essentially nationalism is essentially the desire by a nation or an ethnic group to have their own state. Okay. All right. Now, gender. Actually, I'm not going to talk about that too much, but you can read about that. Now, economic institutions of imperialism were extremely important as well. What you had in these societies was traditional subsistence agricultural economies, right? Now, subsistence economies essentially means, think about it, it means where farmers, peasants grow enough food and other products to subsist, to survive on their yearly or annual harvest. Now, now this obviously means that given that there are no well-developed credit markets, and etc., the economic infrastructure isn't very good, that's what happens. I mean, individuals and families subsist over generations, if not centuries. So but they did generally survive unless there was, long periods of extended drought. Now, what imperialism does is it sort of imposes economic institutions from outside, particularly the market. Remember, but the market. So the international sort of marketplace then imposes itself on these traditional subsistence agricultural economies. And what happens is that peasants are forced to shift away from growing food on which they can subsist to food that can be harvested and then crops, not only food but crops like flowers, for instance, that can be harvested and then sold by those who are running the country at the expense of the indigenous populace, and they certainly didn't receive the fair share of prices. Now, what this does is it does give the peasant the potential, assuming that that peasant has a good harvest year and prices are high, to do very well. But what it also does is it increases the uncertainty of one's essentially subsistence, and there could be years where the crop doesn't do very well and prices on the world market are extremely low. Anyone knows, anyone who's ever followed commodity prices understands the level price movements of crops over time, or commodities over time. And sometimes you're selling into a lack of demand, which means that you will receive much more for your output than you otherwise would. And so what this does is it makes life much more uncertain for individuals. Okay. Another example of the imposition of economic institutions of imperialism was that free trade in the colonies was often suppressed. Okay. Colonies were forced to supply goods only to the imperial country, and of course colonies were forced to buy them finished and manufactured products only from their colonial masters. Okay, colonial masters created extractive economies in the colonies. What does that mean? Well, they extracted goods and commodities from there at the expense of the individuals there, rather than building up rather than building up sort of manufacturing economies. The manufacturing was done, the raw goods and the raw materials were extracted in the colonies, and the manufacturing was done in the imperial country's home. So, cash crops and extractive economies are at the whim of world market fluctuations. Okay. And economic organization under imperialism also impeded, the domestic development, economic development in the colonies, as I said here above, where extractive economies rather than manufacturing economies were created in the colonies. So, what are some of the challenges then that post-imperialism brought? Well, the most obvious was the building of state capacity and autonomy. These were states that were very weak once the colonial masters left, and the major challenge was to generate and build some state capacity and autonomy. Forging social identities was important, given the nature, the sort of quote-unquote arbitrary nature of state boundaries, and then also generating economic growth. Okay, decolonization, I won't sort of go into that. There's a belief that decolonization would be a panacea, so a cure-all for what was ailing the developing countries. But over the last half centuries, right, many of these countries have struggled with these various with these things, and so the question is why? Why have in the era of decolonization or post-colonialism have many developing countries not been able to develop strong stable political and social institutions and strong economic institutions? Okay. Well, here's an example of post-imperialism and development. This is when each of these countries became, this is from your book, you can go take a look at that. Okay, so building state capacity and autonomy. State capacity, we know what that is. We also know what autonomy is. Okay. How capacious, I don't even know if that's a word, and how autonomous are the states in the developing world? Well, here's from World Bank. You can find this on my blog, or you can go to that website. Okay. You notice that probably the more green, the more on that side of the rainbow, the country is, the more capacity and more autonomy the state has. The more red, the less autonomy and capacity it has as well. So you see Russia here is more like Africa than it is like the United States and Canada. Central America, Latin America, particularly South America, is sort of in the middle area right here. Okay. So challenges to building state autonomy and capacity. There's an absence of a professional bureaucracy. Okay. There's often clientelism. We talked about that before. Rent seeking and corruption. Okay. Right. In many of these societies, state jobs and revenue are the way to at least better your livelihood. And so there's often strong competition for state jobs, but because of the corruption, this doesn't produce strong states. Moreover, given that the best and the brightest are competing for state jobs, the private sector is also very poor. So you have the worst of all worlds. And sovereignty, is often compromised by external actors, other states, international organizations, even other actors in neighboring states, particularly if there are ethnic groups on the other side of the border as well as inside. Okay, so forging social identities. Right, I talked about the arbitrary political boundaries that were imposed by the imperial powers, right? And there are often very important, very strong, very major ethnic and